So thank you for joining today. This is the BMES ABET Program Evaluator Training for 2022-25. This is brought to you by the BMES Accreditation's Activities Committee, the AAC. So thanks for joining today, and we'll go ahead and get started. So just to give you a quick overview, we'll go through an intro of sorts, and then we'll dig into what the role of the BMES group is in ABET accreditation. And then we'll go through the ABET program criteria and touch on some key concepts for you. And we'll have some info, hopefully that'll be useful for you during the upcoming reviews. And we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. Today's panelists, I think we're all waving at you hopefully here. So we've got Colin Drummond, I'm Carol Molinax, Ruth Ochia, Charles Tritt, and Jennifer Wayne. So we're all AAC members, and we'll get into a little bit of what that means. But we're here to get you some good info to get you well prepared for this year's cycle of ABET reviews. So just a few announcements to start with. This webinar is recorded. So by staying on, you are consenting to being recorded. We'll send out the website link to that later if there's something you want to come back and look at. So one thing I would say is if you're not speaking, probably go ahead and turn off your cameras, and please stay muted unless you're talking. That'll save our bandwidth and keep us from inadvertently having sounds we didn't intend to have on the recording. As we go through the Zoom meeting, please type in your questions into the chat function. That will help us to gather those questions as well as to be able to answer them. Some may be answerable in the chat, but we'll also try and keep with those. And if that's something that needs to be passed along and answered verbally, we can do that as well. And so after the meeting, you'll also get an email asking for your feedback about the webinar. Please take a few minutes to do that. Hopefully it's going to be a Survey Monkey. It should be less than 5 minutes for you to do that, but it'll help us to try and make the webinar better for next time. All right, and with that, I will pass the microphone virtually over to Jennifer.
Great, thank you, Carol. So I'm really happy to share with you a little bit about this introduction and BMES's role in ABET accreditation. And really, when we think of, Carol, next slide. When we think of ABET, ABET is really made up of our member societies, our professional societies. And that is to set policy, develop strategy, and so forth. For us in the biomedical or bioengineering field, BMES is our lead society that are responsible for our activities, evaluation efforts, program criteria, but we also have cooperating societies that are listed there, including AICHE, ASABI, ASME. And when you are doing a visit, many of you are doing a visit or an interim report this year, not only are you representing ABET, but you're also representing BMES. And if you have a different home society, you are really the representative of those entities. Within BMES, there is the Accreditations Activities Committees called AAC. And we are, the 5 of us are all part of the AAC, as well as several other members that are participating or on the chat. And we are charged with overseeing and managing everything that's associated with the ABET relationship and accreditation, as well as recruiting volunteers, to do ABET reviews. Next slide. So the role of the AAC. When it comes to programs, we facilitate the development and review of our program criteria, as well as the accreditation visit reports for the program and any curriculum trends that might mean that there's a change needed with the program criteria. Relative to PEVs, we solicit nominations for new PEVs. We assign PEVs as well as mentors, which we'll get to in a minute, for ABET accreditation visits. We train PEVs, particularly with respect to our program criteria. And then we review the PEV assessments for quality improvement. Next slide. So once we have a visit, there are several levels of consistency in order to make sure that programs within a field, but really across fields, are all consistent with the level of shortcoming. So there are several dimensions to this and cross checks. First of all, it starts with your review team. So you have a team chair and typically no less than 3 team members. This can be much bigger depending upon the size of the institution. And you're all having discussions associated with the findings that you have regarding student outcomes and other criteria, ABET criteria. But then after that, it goes through several levels of editing. And this is through the editorial or editing individuals with ABET. And there are 2 specific levels, chains that after the visit evaluate the program forms, ensuring consistency across all programs and institutions. And then at the commission meeting, we have a July commission meeting every summer. And there, all of the shortcomings are evaluated by every commissioner in order to determine consistency across programs and institutions. And then finally, the AAC also reviews your initial submissions for consistency across our institutions, as well as potentially identifying EAC commissioners to go forward. Next slide. As far as mentors or consultants, there's a question, Carol, is there a PowerPoint we should see?
We should be sharing a PowerPoint.
Someone else says they
don't see it.
Okay. So
if you don't see a PowerPoint, recommend that you leave and come back in and see if you get it when you come back in.
Thanks, Carol. So the AAC does want to make sure that PEVs have the support they need during their cycle. And so in this little flow chart over here, if you are a PEV with less than 3 BME visits completed, then the AAC assigns an experienced mentor or consultant from our group. If one is not already assigned on the visit team, such as the team chair, if they're an experienced BME program evaluator, or if there's another program evaluator with BME experience, particularly to help with program criteria questions. But if a PEV has greater than 3 visits, greater than or equal to 3 visits, then they can still have consultants, for example, and get engaging members of the AAC if assistance is needed. And so I hope for those that are new that you have been assigned a PEV mentor, or if you're going out, you will be assigned one. Next slide. So assistance, again, additional assistance, the mentor, you're participating in this training. We don't typically have PEVs go out for observation visits. When you go out, you are an evaluator. But again, you can reach out at any time relative to questions, either with an experienced BME PEV or the team chair, and then your consultant. If you have questions during a visit, really the first line of assistance should be within your team, your visit team, team chair, your fellow PEVs. But if you have a question remaining, particularly that's BME specific or you need a second opinion, then certainly contact your mentor or consultant or one of the AAC members. Next slide. Okay, and now I will pass it off.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to be covering the BME program criteria. I will just be doing kind of the first section of this, and then Colin will follow up with the later parts of this. So next slide, please. So these criteria were established by the lead society with input from various other constituencies. They are necessary to customize, refine the general criteria that all programs, engineering programs must abide to, comply with. They're limited to curricular topics, which is generally aligns with the general criteria, criterion 5, and also the faculty qualifications area, which is a supplement to the criterion 6 requirements. And programs must demonstrate that these program criteria are met. So this is a requirement. It's just a requirement only for programs that are appropriate for BME visitors. Next slide, please. And those programs would include programs with bioengineering, biomedical, and similar modifiers in the top their titles. And that would all be worked out more at the ABET level. So once you're assigned to a visit, unless you see something wrong, in which case you should bring that up with ABET if you don't think this is actually a BME program. But if you think the program is correct, or if they think the program is correct for evaluation by BME visitor, it probably is, and you would apply these program criteria to this. Some key words, and this is verbatim what the requirements are, but some key words here is that the structure of the curriculum must provide both breadth and depth. So the breadth and depth are a required part of this. A range of engineering and science topics. So again, it's got to be some engineering topics. There'll likely be some background science topic, and those have to be consistent with the program's educational objectives and student outcomes. So these are customized, not only the fact that this is a BME program and you're the BME visitor for this program, but also how does the program see itself? And you should take that into account. But that's not an unlimited license, as you will see in the further bullet points. Again, as with most things ABET visit-wise, there's always a balancing act. But we're looking for breadth and depth, and we're also looking for an appropriate range of engineering and science topics. Specifically, the curriculum should prepare graduates with experience in, and if we could go to the next slide, although I do want to express, while I'm on this slide now, this idea of experience. As I will say in a moment, I'll get to that in a moment. But experience is a key word I want you to have in your mind as we go through these. I'm not going to read these because we have further slides on each of them. But we are looking to solving engineering problems. We are looking for applying principles of engineering, biology, human physiology, because biomed is a lot about human physiology, chemistry, physics, and math, as well as statistics. And a lot of other engineering curriculum do not have that statistic requirement. So that's one to watch for. There's also, check my notes here. Okay, so I don't want to go into too much details with the last 2 points here because these are Colin's, so we'll leave those for him. Next slide, please. This is the point I was trying to make earlier when I stressed the idea of experience. The program criteria themselves are not outcomes, so you do not have to find them assessed. You should not, in fact, seek to see assessment documentation. You're looking for the fact that they are in the curriculum, they are being presented to the students have the opportunity to learn these things, they are gaining experience in these particular areas, but not necessarily that their learning has been assessed as you would normally see it for a criterion for requirements. If the program specifically includes the program criteria in their students' outcomes, that would be the only situation in which you would want to look for criterion 4 type assessment requirements. So it is driven by the program of what their student outcomes are. And what most programs do is simply provide you with material are covered, textbook references that show the materials in those textbooks, some lecture slides, similar information, just to assure the students have gained some exposure. One area I will circle back to here is this idea of taking measurements from living systems. Again, that's something you're going to look for in the student in the materials provided to you before the visit, and then probably circle back during the visit and maybe ask the students some questions of, what experience did you get? That's one of the things I've done. Okay, next slide, please. Breadth and depth, and again, this is one of those areas that's very much subject to interpretation, but also very important, is you're looking for areas in which a program is claiming depth. You're looking for areas or just the general idea of breadth, and trying to calibrate what you're looking for what the program has advertised themselves as being in terms of their self-study and their description. This is, again, defined by the program, but based on your experience as a biomedical engineer and as a visitor. I believe that's everything I have on this slide, and then I will pass this to Colin at this point.
Thank you very much. I think this slide, the key words at the top are applying principles and solving problems. And sometimes this may be a little vague, but the idea that we heard before was that a lot of this has to do with the way in which the programs define the application of principles. So in this regard, there's flexibility in subtopics. So while the programs have the freedom to determine the specific topics within biology and human physiology, these really need to be described. And the description could stand in a standalone course, or it could be woven into these topics could be woven into other courses. And so that's just something you're gonna have to pay attention to when you're looking at this particular concept. The curriculum should most certainly include solving of the biomedical engineering problems, especially those involving interactions between living and non-living systems. I think the application of the knowledge is extremely important to pay attention to. The program should demonstrate that the students apply the foundational knowledge really to solve these BME specific problems. I think one of the areas to pay attention to is that we want the students to really understand how materials used in devices, that is non-living systems, interact with biological tissues, living systems, and to ensure things like biocompatibility and addressing any potential adverse reactions. Some specific requirements that you might think about or things to pay attention to in terms of these definitions are, and examples would be biocompatibility testing. Can they conduct and interpret biocompatibility tests? Are they exploring or have the opportunity to explore device tissue interaction? How does a pacemaker interact with the heart tissue, or a hip implant integrate with the bone? Things we sometimes overlook are like regulatory standards, knowledge of FDA and equivalent standards that dictate and govern the interaction between humans and devices. And again, another area that sometimes we don't think about, but failure analysis, students really analyzing the devices, and really that's a form of problem solving. So next slide, please. The concept of differential equation and statistics is extremely important, of course, because differential equations are crucial to the modeling and understanding of dynamic systems. They describe processes such as heat transfer, fluid flow, and electrical circuits within the body. And this comes back to something we mentioned really quickly in the earlier slide. There could be, you could have fluid flow, you could have heat transfer. sometimes a curriculum weave this through many, many different courses, or they may have a separate course in a fluid flow and heat transfer. So you have to pay attention to the way in which the program has described that they are going to present these opportunities to learn. So again, your differential equations, I think most people have dedicated courses and maybe not so much in fluid dynamics, but that's just something to pay attention to when you do the curriculum review. But basically, in one way or another, the programs need to really show that the students know how to formulate and solve differential equations relevant to BME applications. I think statistics is sometimes, a lot of students will like roll their eyes or yawn or something like that. But statistics, as we all know, is essential for data analysis, experimental design, and interpreting results in medical research and clinical trials. So it really must be part of the curriculum. And then you really have to demonstrate that there's this opportunity to prove that they've learned this. I think, let's see. So again, programs are free to, implement this in any way they choose. And, depending on what you're visiting, it may just require paying attention. And this is where pre-reading and paying attention to the self-study can ease your journey upon arrival. Next slide, please. So this idea of interaction between living and non-living systems, this is sometimes that, it can be a little bit challenging. Once again, there's no specific list of interactions or problems that must be addressed, but it can, developing materials, developing, understanding of standards that dictate the interaction between the living and non-living systems. You just have to identify the relevant issues in this domain and demonstrate that the curriculum prepares the students really to tackle these. There's a little bit more on this, I think, in a few of the slides to follow, but, and why don't we just go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so making measurements and interpreting data. So again, we have to prepare the graduates for making measurements on and interpreting data from living systems. The students have to be proficient in collecting data from living organisms or biological processes. And this can sometimes be a little, unclear or vague, but it's really about using these techniques and instruments to measure relevant parameters. For instance, physiologic signals, biochemical concentrations, or even biomechanical forces. And some simple examples might be, measuring heart rate, blood pressure, neural activity, and cellular responses. Those would be things that could be factored into a number of different components, maybe even lab courses, something like that. The other part of this that's really important is not only just making the measurements, but also interpreting the data. It's really not just enough to collect the data. You really have to understand the significance of the data. And this interpretation really requires decision-making. And this is good for the students, probably enhances critical thinking skills, but involves the analyzing and drawing conclusions from the data. Sometimes students will be descriptive, and really it's about drawing conclusions. So for instance, are you measuring glucose levels in blood samples and interpret whether those levels are really in a healthy range or indicate a medical condition? Even with simple things like sometimes measuring heart rate, things like that, is somebody, a tachycardia or bradycardia, just being able to understand some of those terms. And again, it's defined by the program, but this idea of interpreting the data is just as important as actually collecting the data. And this is evidence-based, sort of reminds me of medicine, really. The programs have to demonstrate how they teach the skills. The assessment, of course, is a little bit later, but the evidence we're talking about here is course syllabi, laboratory exercises, research projects, things like that. And so this really helps, if they address this criteria, this really suggests the candidates and the graduates are well prepared to work with living systems in their professional careers. Next slide, please.
Actually, before we go to that slide, we have a question in the chat.
Oh, great, sure, okay. I didn't see that.
We've had a university make measurements in one place and interpret them in another. Is that okay?
As long as it's documented, yeah. I mean, it's likely that, I mean, take it to the case where students are working in a lab on the first floor, and then they go home and study and do the interpretation later on. So yeah, as long as it's supervised and documented, then it's fine. Again, this is something that the program would define. Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Shelton?
Yeah, we're not telling you the process. You define the process. It just got to meet the guidelines.
Actually, I meant for two different data sets. So they demonstrated that they could acquire data from living systems. That was done. Then somewhere else, I think it was even a different class, they were given various already acquired data sets from living systems, and then they showed that they could interpret them.
Those are competencies, and to the extent that that is documented in the way your curriculum is structured, fair enough. I mean, let's think about the pandemic. In many cases, just because of being able to conduct experiments or practical concerns, some universities created data sets that then were subject to interpretation just because of the constraints. So I would say it depends on your program, but like everything else, if it's documented and the curriculum offers the opportunity for making measurements and interpreting data, if you meet those competencies, so it goes.
Thanks.
Yep. So the sort of final points on this, when you're on a member of a larger team, you're going to be hearing about program criteria from other programs. And I think that there's a lot of interesting comments, and actually I learned from other programs when I'm on these visits. But I think it's important not to let them influence you. It has to be very specific to BME and BioE. And so their concerns may not be yours. You're not them and they're not you. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. Again, in my mind, a visit is a wonderful opportunity to learn and hear about other organizations and maybe even get some ideas. But still, I think the idea is that the levels of shortcoming are very standard. We have to have some standards on this, and usually either none, concern, weaknesses, or deficiencies. And I think that those are pretty clear. And I would say that it's really important when you review the self-study, in my opinion, that you start to think about what you want to see on your visit. And I would definitely, and I've done this in the past, reach out to my mentor consultant when I first started out, or someone to help you interpret the program criteria so that you can come to the team meetings on your site visit, really being proficient in distinguishing between a weakness and a deficiency. And again, I think that it's very, very important. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, about what happens on your site visit. But I can't emphasize enough that there's people to support you on your journey and to make this a mutually beneficial activity. I think with that, I now turn this over to Ruth.
Yes, thank you very much.
Actually,
So,
before you get off the stage, Colin, you had one other question that came in
Okay.
on the chat. Said if the program requires a statistics course, but the course doesn't have bioengineering applications, is this enough? What if I can't find BME applications in other courses?
I would dig a little deeper. I would say that if the self-study talks about, you're saying that there's a separate course in statistics, when you learn the basics, there's a difference between learning the basics and then the application. So I think that, I hear the question, but I would offer that, yeah, if there's a separate course that teaches statistics, whether it's R or SPSS, whatever it's doing, then it's another phase of the educational process in the curriculum where it's actually applied. And I think that digging into labs and the way labs are taught and lab reports and the way those things are specified in the curriculum, I think you'll find that there's the application in there. So it may not be broken out explicitly, and you might have to tease it out, but chances are it's there. And if you do have a question, this is something to present to the team or even to your liaison at the university to say, hey, give me a little bit more insight on the application, because the competency and the application is extremely important in the world of biomedical engineering. So I guess what I'm saying is communicate. This is really important. If you've got a concern, communicate.
Was that an adequate answer for you, Eileen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so if there are no more questions for Colin, we're going to be talking a little bit about info for your upcoming reviews. And if we look at the next slide, you will see a typical timeline. So you may be asked questions if you're interviewing with students and maybe even some faculty who may not understand the whole entire process of what goes on during the accreditation cycle. And so it is an 18-month cycle. It starts in January when the university says, I'm coming up for my review, and they kind of say they submit a request for evaluation in January of whatever year, in this case, 2024. Their self-studies were due in June. Team chairs are selected. Then the PEVs are selected usually during the summer. And then the site visits will be sometime during the fall. And then after everyone who's a PEV, they feel like they've done their site visit and they're done, we'll talk about that. It actually goes through a huge editing process for the draft statement, the 30-day response, the final statement. And of course, the next July 2025, when we have our commission meeting, that's when all of the final statements will be talked about and agreed on before the universities actually receive the final, like, this is your accreditation situation. So like I said, you may be asked by students, faculty, alums or something like that who may just not understand. So it's important to say that it is a long 18-month process. Next slide. And so when you're going into the cycle, making sure, and at this point in time, hopefully you've all done this, if you had any sort of training that BMES has asked you, or even your pre-visit training that you'll get in the AMS system, I've seen it. So make sure you get all of that stuff. You'll always every year have a code of conduct, which you'll have to agree to. And then also, especially early in the spring, you probably got a notification asking for your availability for any visits in the fall. So this is your opportunity to say, like, I'm going to BMES and I cannot go to a conference, go on a site visit during that week for BMES or something like that. Maybe you have other conferences or other conflicts. So making sure during the spring of every year that you go through and say, this is my availability for a site visit in the fall, because it becomes this huge matching game to say who's available to go and who has a conflict of interest. And if you have other conflicts of interest, if you're on the job market or something like that, if you change positions, you need to update your conflicts of interest so that we can match appropriately. And so when the team chair gets, they're saying, hey, this is when we're going to do it, and this is when we're going to go for the site visit, they'll get assigned from the societies different evaluators. And so the team chair will look and say, hey, do I have a conflict with this person? If not, they'll agree to it. Then it'll go to the institution, and the institution will look for conflicts of interest, and then they'll agree to it. And then it finally comes to you to accept your assignment. And if you haven't accepted your assignment in the AMS, please do so. Your team chair is wondering where you are. And once you accept the assignment, this is when you'll get access. And I saw in the chat that people are getting access to their self-studies at this point. For my visit in the fall, they haven't quite gotten through for the transcripts yet. So that will come to you as well. So you'll have your self-study, your transcripts, and that's when you start doing the work to go through it. And of course, as I've said before, if you've had any questions, please go and ask your mentor or your team chair at this point. Then they have, at the site visit, it's usually 2.5 days. The first day will have your laboratory visits. You're looking at materials. A lot of the conversations, and we'll be talking about communication, it's so important, should be done beforehand. So hopefully a lot of the things should have been dealt with beforehand. And this is where you're actually looking to see stuff. Day one, which is typically Monday, you're interviewing students, faculty, alums, whoever you've come up with and worked with the coordinator of your program to say, hey, this is who I want to work with. And then after you leave, and as a PEV, you may say like, hey, I'm done, but your team chair may come back to you if there are any questions through the editing process. So making sure you keep those materials, because you're the one who evaluated that program, and your team chair didn't read everything, didn't interview the people that you did. So they may come back and say, hey, can you help me out? There is a question about something that was written. Next slide. Okay, so this is just reiterating that you are the boots on the ground, and your team chair really does depend on you to know what's going on in that program. Because you may have a small program. I've been on a program where there's only 2 of us. You may be on a very large program where there's 20 some odd people, and the team chair is not reading every self-study, and they're not able to talk to all these people. So you need to actually make sure that you are up on the general criteria and the program criteria, and that you've done all of your pre-training and all your conflicts of interest, and making sure if something comes up that you tell your team chair as soon as possible, so things could get settled as quickly as can be. Next slide. So you may or may not, depending on how many of these visits, you'll see this form, the E331. And if you want any worksheets, you go and you go to the workbooks, get the workbook for this cycle, the 2024-2025 cycle. And don't use anything that, oh, I used this 2 years ago. No, don't use 2 years ago, use the new one, because they do change as we go forward. You will be asked for these forms from a member of the Biomedical Engineering Society for ABET. They want to see what these look like, but this will go through, and hopefully you can see that it talks about the criteria, and it gives you the language that you should be looking for. And it's really nice in that respect. And and you can see in this second Excel worksheet on the backside, it'll start from like pre-visit going all the way to exit statement. So it's nice to see how things have changed as you've gotten more information, and you're evaluating and assessing all of these things, where things will maybe get better or worse. And you can see the different, at the top in that box, you can see how you can report it, whether or not you've reviewed it or not. So it's good saying, hey, I reviewed this, or I haven't seen it. If you have more information that you need, then you can mark it that way. And if you've come up with a shortcoming, then you'll be marking it as a shortcoming, and you can see how that may change from day to day. So you have for the general criteria, and the sheet we have for bioengineering has the program criteria listed there. So these are very useful, and your team chair may ask for it as well. So make sure you're familiar with these, and that you use these as you go through your visit. Next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, we had a question in the chat. Should the program conduct a transcript analysis to support and enhance the PEV's review process?
We would love if they would actually you try to be as helpful as possible. So if you don't understand how somebody gets they substitute a class and it's not written anywhere. So you ask, if you're like, I see that student X, whatever the student is, has this course, but basically your table 5.1 has another class. Can you walk me through it? Okay, so you want them, and hopefully as you're talking to them and you're doing your transcript analysis early, if you have some questions, they can find it, because it may be something they have to go back to the registrar or something like that to get more information, but hopefully they've documented substitutions or anything like that to make it as easy as possible. Once again, if you can't see it, don't intuit, just ask them and just say, I'm not seeing how this, fits. That work?
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, so, and in this case, I'm just going to say communication. You need to be talking to people all the time. So if you haven't got like your transcripts, talk to your team chair. So my evaluators haven't got any transcripts because I haven't got any transcripts. So I'll be talking to them saying, your transcripts, as soon as they're released, you'll get them. I mean, I can't, move the university any faster. So really at the beginning, you're going to probably have 1, 2, maybe more conversations with your team chair. They'll probably do virtual meetings to just say like, hey, how you doing? What's going on? So don't wait. Please don't wait until it's like, oh, my visit is until November. So that means I don't have to do anything till like October 31st. No, your team chair is having like a heart attack at that point. So they will have different visits and seeing what questions you have and where you are with your evaluation. If you have some questions, collate your questions. You can talk to your program coordinator, whoever's your institution's point person, to say, can you provide some clarifications on this? I'm not seeing this other thing. So you're having this conversation, and remember that those conversations, if you're emailing back and forth, should be, you have a CC to the team chair and to usually the dean of the college. And that's to show that there's transparency in your conversations. You'll be working with your coordinator as well to set up your schedule, who you're visiting with. Do you want to have only graduates? Did you want to talk to graduating students? Do you want to have some younger students, some earlier academic career students? So you need to have that conversation so that they can set up your Monday schedule system so that it's going to be as fruitful as possible for you. So another thing is that you don't need to talk to everyone. Some programs are really tiny. There's 4 people, there's 2 people. You could probably talk to everybody. But if you have a program that has 50 people, there's no way you're going to talk to 50 people. So be selective of who you want to talk to so that you get kind of a good overall picture of what's going on. During the visit, your team chair is going to be chatting with you and setting up meetings on like every day and probably in the evening during dinner. So making sure that you're trying to keep up with what's going on. And if anything's coming up, you're talking to your team chair, okay? And I saw that, you know, the E331 is going to be sent out. I think Carol said that. So you'll have an access to that. Because like I said, your team chair will want to see it, and then your BMES coordinator will want to see it as well. So making sure you're keeping up with that and that you finalize it so that it's ready to go once your visit is done. And also your team chair may ask you questions about your program if something comes up in the editing process. So making sure that you don't deep six everything right at the end of the visit. Next slide. Okay, you're planning your trip. Maybe you know where you're going, that's great. And maybe you don't. But if you do know, we have to use Concur. So you have to go to abet.org, sign in, and use Concur for your travel. And that's very specifically how you're going to get down there. Airfare, train fare, are you renting a car, what's going on? So you have to use it. Some people like it more than others. My institution uses Concur, so I get it everywhere I go. It's all like Concur. So making sure that that's how you book your travel. So your travel is going to be paid by ABET. So they're going to direct bill to ABET for that. Your hotel room, usually the institution, your team chair should tell you, like, we're going to be staying at XYZ hotel. You need to call that hotel, make sure if they have like a booking area that hopefully has whatever the university's rate is, and you pay for that hotel and then submit through Concur your receipts and any other receipts that you have. So ABET wants the full receipts. Make sure if you eat anything, you have an itemized receipt. Okay? You need to turn in the itemized receipt. There is, as far as I know, no per diem that they're looking at. If you eat with more than one person, typically your team chair will say, hey, we're going to have a team dinner. And the team chair will pick up the bill and say who's on it. Fine. But if you end up eating with another PEV, maybe you're having breakfast with somebody else and you pick up the bill, make sure you're listing out who you ate with, and that receipt has to get submitted into Concur. So your team chair will talk about meals and everything. If you have any dietary restrictions, make sure you tell your team chair. So when they're making plans for the dinners, lunches and stuff like that, that we can take care of that. Also, some places have maybe the airport's far from the hotel, and the hotel may be a little distance from the university. Talk to your team chair. Please don't rent a car, because we don't need to have 20 people with 20 different cars if we don't need it. So the team chair will say, hey, we need more than one car, and then they'll help organize it. So hopefully that helps with some of that. And at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Colin.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to something that Ruth just mentioned about communication. And I think that, when we identify potential shortcomings, there's, obviously going to be a lot of anxiety with some organizations about being presented with shortcomings. And so the only, sort of the way to diffuse that, if you will, is through communication and preparation. I can't stress enough how important it is to go through the self-study and review it. Don't, like Ruth was talking about, don't review it like the 2 days before, because you're not going to pick up the knowledge about the program that you need. But basically, the self-study should be pretty clear. And one way to think about the site visit is to see, does the site visit align with what the self-study is stating, and do those meet the guidelines? So the site visit's very, very important, because in there you may identify shortcomings that you thought were fine based on the self-study. So once again, it's this interview to help map, what is in the self-study against what you experience in real time. And so I think that really, we're just looking at compliance. It's not a value judgment. It's about compliance of the criteria, and does the self-study provide all the information necessary to do the necessary assessments. Another big source of information on site visits is the interviews. And we have long days, and there could be a lot of interviews, as Ruth has suggested. I think it's important to, I know it's an obvious thing to say, is to really pay attention. Sometimes it helps to take notes, but to really listen to the faculty, the staff, and the students. And if you haven't read the self-study in detail, it's going to be really tough to interpret what's going on. Now, the students, there are occasions where you're going to meet with the students in the absence of any faculty. I would have to say that if they're complaining about food, parking, that's not really what we're really concerned about. But, you want to hear what they have to say, and listen very, very careful to them, because especially sometimes there may be some faculty that want to hang around, but if this is a meeting with just you and the students, be sure that is the situation, because then the students will be very free, and it's a good source of information. It really is just another aspect that's extremely important. So, so being observant takes a lot of attention. It's very tiring, but you have to be very, very diligent. And this is what's going to be, your eyes are and ears are going to be what helps your team chair be able to articulate shortcomings in the best possible way. Next slide, please. And these are some shortcomings. You can read these. So there's some topics that seem to be recurring, like in the curriculum, the standards using the constraints in the capstone. Again, this comes back to some topics that maybe an organization may be sort of glossing over standards. In some students' minds, that may not be the most exciting topic, but nothing happens without standards. So you can see here there's some things that might pique your interest, or things to pay attention to. The PEOs, is it a systematic review? Are the constituencies involved? It's one thing to say it in the self-study, but it's another to hear it live when you have the lunch and talk to some of the constituents and see what's going on. So, this is a good slide. It's a good reference. It's got some good comments and things to pay attention to. I think lab tours are also a wonderful opportunity to take a look at what's happening on the ground. Lab safety is extremely important, because, as you know, with tight budgets, sometimes this may be overlooked. And so it's just a matter of not looking necessarily, but being observant. So this is a great slide, really covering a lot of different things to pay attention to. And if we could move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit. When you write up the shortcomings, this becomes something, this is not a Shakespearean one-act play. It's a very specific construct, and that construct is there for a reason. And it has to be done in a very specific format. And there's good reasons for that. History would show that this is the way to present it, because then if there's any controversy or questions, you follow the format, and the format can actually help resolve the issues in advance. So state the criterion in question. It might say, oh, it's this. Be very specific and use accurate wording. And then indicate what the observation was counter to the compliance. So it's really an observation. So this is something that might be iterative. And then after you state the observation, indicate what that consequence is and what that means. So this is where you actually start to express this in the form of a concern, a weakness, or deficiency. And I think it's going to be super important, again, to know the self-study and to know the criterion to be able to operate proficiently in this domain. And then, of course, you wrap it up with a sentence that states the assessment of the level of compliance with the criterion. It's your team chair that's going to have to read these and defend these, and you're the person that's going to be providing the data. So this is important to be very specific about the observation and factual and really evidence-based. And so again, this construct, to some people, they're like, oh, it seems very bureaucratic. It's there for a reason. Use it. It's your friend when you're trying to help with continuous process improvement. And with that, I think I'm turning this over to Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Helen. I just wanted to talk a little bit about PEV growth opportunities. You're all really focused on the self-studies that you're getting access to or you have access to, and then doing your visits in the fall. But there are opportunities as you are a PEV that you might like to take advantage of. Of course, remaining as a PEV is very worthwhile and staying in that role. Some of the feedback that we have received on improving their skill set within the role, PEVs are performing really very well. The pie chart on the right tells a little bit about where there have been some competency groups identified or some, if you will, issues to address. For example, poor shortcoming writing, poor visit preparation, which I think Colin has really emphasized and Ruth and everyone has emphasized. Poor listening within the team, a bias, poor responsiveness, poor coordination of shortcomings with the program chair prior to the exit statement. So these are all in terms of where there have been some issues in the past. Next slide. But if you're interested in going on to other opportunities, of course, you can become a PEV mentor, and that is something that the AAC, BMES's AAC, the Accreditation Activities Committee does. And as we talked about earlier, we assign mentors, and so if you have many cycles under your belt, then you might be able to help new ones. Being a member of the Accreditation Activities Committee, where experienced PEVs can help with the process we described earlier. And of course, there are other BMES leadership positions. The diagram on the right talks about the Accreditation Activities Committee and how it is structured, including our Quality Assurance Coordinator, which is Carol, and reps to the Board of Delegates, which is another entity within the ABET structure. So a variety of opportunities if you want to grow in the future years. Next slide. And then, of course, there are opportunities with ABET. If you have many years under your belt, you can also speak with AAC about becoming a commissioner, which also means that you are a team chair. So the team chair role now is from the commissioners, and then you're grouping and coordinating all of the PEVs. The commissioner is a position within ABET. We do the commission meeting every July, but they are coordinated through, of course, BMES AAC. And so the AAC is actually the one that suggests new commissioners. Further along, there's also ABET editor. I mentioned that earlier, but these are experienced commissioners who are nominated by the ABET Board of Directors to become an editor. And they're one of the very important parts for assuring consistency, which we also discussed earlier. And of course, many other ABET leadership positions. As you can see here, XCOM, and then of course within the EAC, which is our commission out of the 4 commissions. Okay, next slide.
Well, I'll pick up here. Thank you, Jennifer. We have just a final slide before we go to questions. Some reminders for the first point is that you need to review the materials provided prior to the visit, and really you should do this as soon as you get access to it. I've certainly found that the sooner I can get feedback to the program, start having my questions answered, so that by the time I get to the visit, most of my questions have been answered. Simply making observations and confirming what I've already read and understood from the self-study. Your team chair will likely require that you submit drafts of both your exit statement and some of the forms prior to the visit. They're supposed to do that, I believe, and mine have been the last several cycles. This was not the way ABET operated when I first started making my visits. I guarantee you that having that done ahead of time is very useful. It's a lot less work on site, and you can focus your attention when you're during the visit on actually observing things, not preparing your documentation. So have that documentation done early, make your TC happy, and everybody will be happy. You will have help through the review cycle. Certainly your team chair is a place to start if you have questions. We will have mentors assigned to all the new PEVs or newer PEVs. Use your mentor. I know Jennifer was my mentor. I recall reaching out to her with a couple of questions during visits and being certainly both practically helped by her, but also just helped in terms of having confidence that I was making the right response to my team chair. When you do your accreditation action in your exit statement, that needs to be based on evidence. You need to be able to defend that, discuss that, help other people understand what your concern is and how that concern relate to the criteria and your observations. So be sure you do that. After you, as you're completing the visit, actually, you want to forward copies of your E33 or 331 form, as well as your exit statement to Carol, who is the AAC Quality Control Coordinator, and she will extract from those the summary information you just saw. And then finally, don't forget to complete your review of your team chair and your fellow PEVs, because that's an opportunity to help them improve, and certainly then pay attention to whatever feedback you get during your review. So those are all just some reminders. They've all been mentioned previously in this presentation, but some very important points.
I have one. I was wondering when the self-study reports would be ready.
Of course, the July 1st, the self-studies have been submitted by the institutions, and it is really your team chair. So if you've already accepted and you still have not accepted the assignment, and you still have not received access to the self-study, then contact your team chair.
So what happens if I haven't heard anything from any assignments for anything at all? Because I called independently to see what was going on, and I haven't heard anything from anybody. I've been checking my ABET dashboard, and there's really nothing there for studying right now.
So if you haven't been assigned yet this year, you most likely can assume that you've been released. Now, I like to have a little bit of a bench, because the last 2 years we've had some dropout at the last minute. Illness, injury, somebody in the family getting sick, whatever. So we end up scrambling at the last minute to find maybe one more PEV. But generally, if you haven't received an assignment request, you're released for this year. That said, all the people that I have assigned to a visit have accepted. We're 100% on that. Thank you, everybody. We probably beat all the other societies in getting to that point. Yes, we try to give people a visit every other year at least so that they don't have to go through retraining, which used to be burdensome. Now it's about just a 1 or 2 hour virtual training. So it's not awful, but we still try to avoid that. Most people who've reached out to me about wanting annual visits, we do have a system of recording that. And we try to accede to those requests. But as Carol just mentioned, we had a huge influx of new PEVs last year, this year, and coming up for 2025 as well. So we want to make sure they go out on visits to gel their initial training. So they have the first priority. And because we had so many, that pushed some of the people with 2-3 years or so of experience down the list a little bit.
Go ahead and say thank you for attending today's webinar. Please watch out for an email survey request to come out fairly soon. That'll help us with our own personal internal continuous improvement loop for the committee and for the webinar. So just should be really short, a couple of minutes for that. And other than that, good luck with your upcoming cycle ABET review.